This podcast is sponsored by the Red Hat Developer Program. Download our latest O'Reilly book, Building Reactive Microservices in Java. Learn why Eclipse Vertex is a good choice to build effective microservice systems. Download it now at infoq.link/Red Hat.
Hello and welcome to the InfoQ podcast. My name is Wes Reisz and I'm your host. Today's podcast deviates a bit from our normal approach. Typically, I interview a thought leader each week in software, speaking about things that might be featured at QCon or on InfoQ. These are people like Adrian Cockcroft of AWS, Matt Rainey of Uber, Tyler Akato, the Beam lead from Google, many other people that you'll find at QCon. Today, while hopefully still considered thought leaders, Charles Humble, the chief editor of InfoQ, and I are recapping 2017 and talking about the trends that we're seeing from our foxholes from InfoQ in 2018. So thanks again for joining us for InfoQ podcast, and we look forward to joining you again on your commutes, jogs, and downtime in 2018. Charles, welcome to the InfoQ podcast.
Thank you very much indeed for having me, Raz. It's quite fun to be on the other end of one of these. So looking forward to it.
This is interesting to have one of our chats recorded.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's start off. You are the chief editor of InfoQ. What does it mean to be the chief editor of InfoQ?
So it's kind of interesting and fun to do it. Broadly, my job splits into two different things. So there's the day-to-day operational stuff, so making sure that we're producing the content that we need to produce across the various different formats, so news, long-form articles, videos, podcasts, and so on. I also do a bit working with our marketing team on any promotions that we're doing. I manage the freelance team, so that's our regular team of about 50 writers that produce content all the time. And then the other chunk of my job is more strategic. So it's thinking about what topics should we be covering? Do we have, it's effectively the what's coming. It's almost a bit like being an analyst. You're trying to look quite a long way ahead and think of the million things that are being talked about and being hyped up about at the moment, which ones are relevant, and should we be starting to kind of get people together so that we can talk about those. So it's pretty varied and interesting. How about for you? What does a typical sort of day look like for you when you're planning a QCon?
Yeah, I'll tell you, what you just said is pretty much exactly what my day looks like. We have four conferences now with QCon AI. So there's always a conference in flight. And so I'm usually in some stage of looking at what are the talks that are most relevant in 2 months, 3 months, 4 months when the conference is coming up. What are the topics that our core audience or our core persona, architects, senior developers want to hear about? Talking to people, doing interviews, and just understanding what kind of the movers and shakers in software are out there doing. So that way, when we have a topic, a track, or a need in one of the tracks, I know who's out there doing it. For example, I had an email just recently from someone, I won't name them because they're not out yet, but he's working in self-driving cars. So he emailed me last week and said, hey, I think we're at a point ready to start talking about this. So I'll chat with him, find out kind of whether this is a technical talk, whether it's a keynote, and then one of the conferences that are coming up, we'll try to work to get this particular person actually on stage to do a keynote. That's kind of what kind of my day looks like as far as content. I'll tell you though, while I have this here, one of the things that I also spend a lot of time to is with our speaker prep, and it's one of the things that I'm like hugely proud of that we do with QCon. So what we do is we do interviews with every single one of our speakers. Now remember, there's 93 speakers at each conference, and there's 4 of them now, or 3 of them plus the QCon AI, which will be a little bit smaller. So we do interviews with everybody, and we talk about the audience. We talk about the types of questions that the audience have. Like, it's very senior audience that typically comes to QCon. So a very senior technical audience want to know, they realize that there's no perfect unicorn architecture out there, that there's been all these missteps to get to this architecture. So it's like talking to people. What were those missteps? And then getting people to bring those forward in their actual talks, and then kind of talk about the journey of creating architecture. So we do interviews, we do webinars, and then we've also started a rehearsal community. And the rehearsal community is where we literally pair our speakers up with someone else who's got an 85% green or above in our talks, so that you can get like a peer review, kind of a code review. So just a little humble brag. This is kind of modeled after every single talk I've ever given that just totally bombed. But it's the rehearsals, the webinars, and the interview, I think, is one of the things I'm really proud of. I spent a lot of time doing that as well. So InfoQ is kind of really well known, as QCon is, for architecture, Java, .NET culture coverage. Can you talk a bit about each one of these areas and what you've seen with InfoQ? Maybe start with Java.
Sure. See, just thinking about the year that's just been, so obviously Java 9 shipped. With it, the Java module framework came, so that was the thing that was originally called Jigsaw and was kind of like the Duke Nukem Forever of the Java world. It just seemed, is it going to ship? Is it going to ship? It eventually shipped in Java 9, which was nice. Also in Java 9, Garbage First became the default garbage collector for Java, so that sort of replaces Parallel GC as the default collector. Garbage First has been there for a while, but it's interesting that it's got to that level of maturity where it can be the default collector now.
So what else about 10? 10's going to be out here in a few months now, right?
Yes, indeed. So, I mean, in some ways, that's I think is the really interesting thing. So Oracle announced plans to move to a biannual release cycle with Java, starting with what is now going to be Java 10, I believe. There was some debate. The reason I say that is because there was some debate about the naming scheme, but I think they've settled on, like an incremental major version. So Java 10 will be GA in March of next year, in theory, and then Java 11 will also ship in 2018, which is very interesting. It's going to be really interesting if you're a big old school enterprise and you're struggling to keep up with a release every couple of years. I wonder how you're going to really keep up with a release every 6 months. Obviously, the releases themselves will be smaller. So if you look at what's in Java 10, local variable type inference is one thing which will sort of bring Java a bit more in line with, I guess, var in C# or auto in C++ or, var val in Scala and so on. The scope of type inference was broadened a bit in Java 8, and so it's really continuing the same theme. There's also some interesting stuff around the JIT compiler, Grawl it's called, which is a kind of experimental JIT compiler for the Linux x64 platform. So there's some interesting things in there. It's not a huge release, as you would expect. It's really hard to know how that's going to play out for, as I say, for the big enterprises. I just don't know at this point.
I think it's pretty interesting because they're going to put a point on the calendar and they're going to say, at this point, whatever's ready to ship will go into the next release. And it doesn't, it'll slide 6 months. And I actually, a lot of people I've talked to are really against the idea, but I think it's a nice approach because it's more modular, it's more small, it's being able to ship things faster. It's what we're doing with software, so why shouldn't we do it with our frameworks? I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, as I say, it certainly has its plus points. I mean, historically there has been a huge problem with these sort of big monolithic type releases that have slipped and slipped and slipped again. And if they can bring in some predictability into it, that might work. I just know, having also worked, as I guess you because you worked at HP for a while, so you'd be familiar with the other end of this as well, that if you've got to manually test a bunch of large enterprise applications and go, does this still work with this new version of Java because somebody wants to use a feature in the new version of Java, and that's a painful process. Like I say, I don't know how it's going to work out. I kind of admire them for trying it. I think in general, Oracle's stewardship of Java has probably been better than a lot of people would have anticipated. There have been bumps along the way, but generally, I don't think they've done a bad job. And I mean, you probably remember when Oracle acquired Sun, there were real concerns about that. Like I say, it's interesting. I don't know how well it will work in practice, because we haven't tried it yet. But yes, two big releases of Java next year is interesting. If it allows Java to move and evolve a bit quicker, I think on balance, that's probably a really good thing. A couple of other big things in Java land. It's been a really big year for Java, actually. So IBM opened up its runtime, so J9 was open sourced, and Java EE got open sourced as well. So that moved over to Eclipse as EE4J. Java EE, at least in my opinion, it's fallen a bit behind the needs of a lot of modern developers. Doesn't mean it doesn't have its uses, but it's not really it wasn't designed for a cloud come microservices kind of environment. And obviously, increasingly, that's how software is being built. So moving it to an open source foundation is interesting. The microprofile initiative, which was a kind of, I think Red Hat started that originally, but that was basically looking at trying to do a microservices type thing for Java EE. That's also moved to Eclipse. So maybe E4J and the microprofile will sort of merge in some way. Perhaps microprofile might become a sub-project of E4J or something. That's all quite interesting. Gives the Spring beat Cloud Foundry people a bit of competition, which I think is no bad thing. For what it's worth, I mean, Spring Boot and Spring, Pivotal people in general, have obviously been doing incredibly well in the meantime. Spring 1 was last week, and it was in Moscone West. I think it's the biggest Spring conference they've ever had.
I think it was like 3,000, wasn't it?
Something like that, yeah. I mean, they've just been on a huge sort of growth curve there. So that's really exciting. It's been a good old year for Java, I think.
And Kotlin's really matured this year as far as the talking JVM, the platform, not Java the language, but Kotlin has really come on strong. I love some of the stuff that we've heard about coroutines, the way that they're just kind of removing developer friction and just making it easier to do threads and kind of the semantics of the language and being able to just use it. I think that's been pretty cool as well.
I agree. I think the sort of official, so Kotlin got blessed by Google as like an officially recognized language for Android at Google I/O, right? And I think that's, again, has just really kind of helped the language get a bit of momentum. The fact that it looks quite similar to Swift probably doesn't do it any harm either. If you're developing for iOS in Swift and then you're developing for Android in Kotlin, the two languages feeling quite similar doesn't do you any harm, right?
And if you look at their roadmap, I mean, we've got Kotlin being able to first compile to JavaScript, run on a JavaScript VM, and now with LLVM, they're targeting other things. You can target a Raspberry Pi, you can target iOS. Kotlin native is going to be able to do a lot of interesting things, I think.
Yes, I agree. And again, I think it's kind of interesting to have a new language on the JVM that's sort of caught on in the way that, say, I guess Groovy or Scala or Clojure have done to some extent. It seems to have found a very definite kind of niche of developers, and it's really growing. It's exciting to see that, I think. I mean, obviously, having JetBrains behind you does no harm.
Yeah.
Do make phenomenally good tooling, which is always a good thing, right?
Now bringing that to a language is really intense. Being able to have that same kind of developer experience that you get with an IDE as you're interacting with a language itself is really a compelling thing.
Yes, I think so. I mean, in some ways, I think what Microsoft were able to do with Visual Studio and .NET in the sort of early days of .NET is similar, that if you build the IDE and the language, there are certainly some plus points that gives you in terms of just making the whole developer experience really seamless.
So you just brought up .NET. .NET also has seen a huge uptick on InfoQ as well, hasn't it?
Yeah, it really has this year.
Any ideas why?
I think a lot of it, to be honest, so that Microsoft as a company, at least looking at it from the outside, seems to have really changed. The change in leadership there sort of resulted, I think, in a significant change of attitude. .NET Core really seems to be has really caught people's imagination, I think. There's something very appealing about being able to use a subset of .NET and run that on Linux, which, let's face it, is what most people actually run in their data centers. That is just really appealing. C# in many ways is a very nice language. I mean, yes, it's very similar to Java and it has its strengths and weaknesses, but on the whole, it's just a lovely language to code in. But I think if you think of InfoQ's audience as being a bit more kind of open source oriented, a bit, that kind of mindset, think open source, think Linux and so on, for a long time, .NET wasn't really an option. And suddenly it is. And yeah, I mean, the .NET, particularly .NET Core 2 stuff that we were writing about over the summer really caused a huge surge in kind of reader interest. Again, I actually think it's a really good time for .NET, for Microsoft in general even.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some things happening, particularly I was just mentioning coroutines with Kotlin. Coroutines came about with async and await. So with the .NET features, I think, I'm not going to quote the version because I can't remember when it came out exactly, but that's where coroutines were first implemented. So there's some interesting things that are adopted by each of these languages that we should be watching.
Definitely. Absolutely, yeah.
So we mentioned Java, we mentioned .NET. Clojure has also really come on this past year, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's been really fascinating to me. So we've been writing about, I mean, sort of culture, and before that, Agile was one of the things that InfoQ started with, and it's sort of, it's bumbled along. It's an important part of our content, but there seems to have been a real surge in interest. I think there's a bit of it that maybe that the industry is just waking up to the idea that, hey, maybe technology is actually the easy bit.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think you can't ignore the fact that last year there have been a lot of quite uncomfortable difficult stories around, ethics in software, with whether that's how, I don't know, Uber acted in certain regulatory terms, or how services like Facebook possibly got used by foreign governments to try and influence the outcome of elections, all of those kind of things. There's obviously been a huge diversity story running this year, not exclusively in our industry, but again, in the technology sector as well. And I think we all know that kind of sexism in the industry is a problem. It is very widespread. I think the fact that we're starting to talk about that is a good thing. And, we know that this matters. We know that having more diverse teams will perform better and will produce better products. This is just reality now. So it's interesting. I think for us that we do the InfoQ Culture podcast as well as this podcast, and that's been rapidly adding listeners this year. And I think you saw the same thing at QCon San Francisco, right, with the culture tracks doing really kind of unusually well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually running the Java track this year, and we swapped it for the track that was the whole engineer, a soft skills track. I think it's soft skills and culture, things that are actually, it goes back to actually what you just said just a few minutes ago, that the industry is kind of waking up to the whole idea that kind of the technology may not be the hard bits about writing software successfully at scale and iterating really quickly, that it's the people problems that are actually starting to kind of crop up and trip companies up and knock them down. So I think we're definitely seeing that with soft skills, kind of the things that are all the bits about being a developer that have nothing to do with writing a code, soft skills, and the cultural aspects of how do you take a team of 10 or 100 and grow it to a team of 100 or 1,000 and be able to keep that culture, that same feel that makes you want to come in and do awesome things.
I guess generally alongside that, I mean, again, if we think of the particularly in the Bay Area where competition for talent is so strong, then you're finding people, retaining people, motivating people is a really, it's like a key competitive advantage in a sense. And again, I think maybe there's a realization of that. It's not just having incredibly talented people, but it's also creating an environment that they actually want to operate in and feel that they can do their best work in. That's, I think, is part of that as well.
So still talking 2017, any big stories, any big news items that kind of surprised you last year?
We ran about 4 or 5 stories on quantum computing, which I didn't see coming at the start of the year. If we'd been doing this time last year and you'd said, what are the big things, I would not have had quantum computing on my list. I mean, obviously, we know it's being worked on.
So I'm slow, Charles. When you say quantum computing, this is Star Trek, Star Wars, right? What is quantum computing?
This immediately gets incredibly difficult to describe.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's right on the edge of my kind of comprehension. But the basic idea is that while as with a conventional computer where you have a bit which is either a 0 or a 1, a quantum computer can represent the 2 states simultaneously. So I kind of think of it as being like a sphere rather than a switch, if that makes any sense at all. It's significant because in theory it allows you to do certain kinds of computational tasks much, much more quickly than are currently possible. And the area where that gets the most focus on right now is on crypto, on encryption, because so much encryption relies on asymmetric keys, and really if you have a fast enough computer, then all of that stuff will eventually cease to work. Of course, it's also true that you can probably come up with new keys using quantum computers that are harder to crack, and so the sort of the standard crypto arms race carries on. But yeah, it's just the thing that surprised me wasn't the fact that IBM and Google and Microsoft and companies like D-Wave who've been doing this for a while are building systems and shipping systems. It was the fact that you could go to GitHub, download a Python library, sign up to IBM's I think it's on Bluemix, on IBM's cloud anyway, and play with a 16-qubit processor for nothing. It's like, oh, hello. So this is now a thing that's actually there that you can actually use as distinct from a hypothetical thing that's coming at some indefinite point in the future. Now, I mean, we're a long way from 50-qubit processors and the sort of quantum supremacy stuff is some way away. But I think of all the things that happened this year, just because it's the one that I totally didn't see coming. It's that one of those moments when you're like, yeah, I know this is a thing, but this is a thing I can actually use. People have built systems that I have access to. Maybe if I work for NASA or something, I might have access to them. But for just, some random person at home being able to play with a quantum computer, that seemed like quite a big deal to me. So I think that was the one that really blindsided me this year. I just didn't see it coming. So that was kind of interesting. What about you? Anything that sort of surprised you from QCon?
I don't know if surprise is the right term, but maybe just the signs on the road were that they were coming and it's just really starting to be realized. But that's just, well that we're starting a new conference next year, QCon AI, wrapped around the idea of artificial intelligence and machine learning for the software developers. So I think the commoditization of AI and ML, things that's making it more approachable for somebody without a PhD to be able to use AI and ML in their day-to-day jobs and in their shops and their mobs and their data centers. I think that's pretty interesting. I mean, back WWDC was at Core ML they introduced for iOS. We're seeing APIs out there that are become available from all the cloud providers that you can do speech and text processing, NLP type work. Keras, it's been out for longer than just last year, but it sits on top of something like TensorFlow to be able to make it even easier for developers to be able to kind of build, train, and then score data. So I think that some of this, it's not so much, like I said, it's not really surprising, but I think it's like surprisingly obvious, I guess. But just the effect of AI and ML this past year and what I think 2018 is going to hold has been one of the big highlights, at least for me, for this year.
I very much agree with that. It's obviously been bubbling around for a while, but this year felt like, there's that moment when it's almost like someone pours rocket fuel on it.
Yeah.
It suddenly just really takes off and explodes. And that's been the year with machine learning and AI, I think. I think what you were saying is absolutely bang on, which is what's happened in this year is that an awful lot of kind of more accessible ways of playing with the stuff and exploring the stuff has just happened. And it just feels like there's a real momentum building up around AI and ML. But it also feels like there are a bunch of problems that we already know that we can solve or can solve to some extent with this technology that are really exciting. So if all machine learning can do is help us to process images, that's still a really big deal, right? There are thousands and thousands and thousands of photographs being taken. And if I can use a computer to categorize them and, recognize people or recognize faces or whatever, that in itself is a really big deal. So it's kind of like there are whole categories of problems. I'm sure you've done this, and I know I have, where I'm thinking about things that have been just unsolvable for InfoQ, like how do we make our video archive searchable? We do this vast amount of video, can't really search video that well on Google. Well, yeah, if you can understand the images, if you can do some kind of speech to text thing with NLP, then suddenly that becomes much more searchable. Funnily enough, is something I'd like to play with. So yeah, I agree. I just think it's a really exciting time. And as we mentioned it a couple of times, but as you said, we are doing a conference next year basically on this basis.
So let's switch gears into 2018 a bit. So let's start off with New Year's resolutions. It's just coming up on the end of the year. What's your technology-focused New Year's resolution for 2018?
I sort of hinted at it already. The big thing that I want to do is I've had this sort of idea for a while of trying to find a way to make the InfoQ video archive searchable. So I just want to play with, I have this idea in my head, which may turn out to be complete rubbish, but my idea is, could we feed the audio through some kind of NLP engine and then use, I don't know, Lucene or something like that to index the result? Because the result wouldn't be good enough to publish, but it might be good enough to search. So that's the thing that I want to do. So I want to learn a bit more about NLP and how it works. I'll need to dust off my very rusty search engine knowledge and kind of get into a bit of playing in that particular space. So that's a big thing that I want to do over the next 12 months. I also feel like, I was a sort of Java developer by trade, and given this new high-speed Java thing that we were talking about earlier, I should probably try and figure out what's in Java 10 or something and have a play with some of the Gruel stuff and whatever, because that looks kind of fun too. How about for you?
Yeah, so first off, we share a common experience with the Java stuff, so I'll definitely be looking at Growl, depending on how we pronounce that. I'll definitely be looking at focusing on 9 and 10 coming up. Of course, I'll be doing that. But I think I'm also going to spend a bit more formal time with Python. And the reason Python is, again, the AI ML slant. So it'll be with Jupyter Notebooks. It'll be with Pandas and NumPy and Scikit-learn. it'll be basically better understanding some of the data. For example, if you go to a QCon, which you do and you know well, we have a really good number of evaluations as you leave. Something like 95% of the audience wave a NFC reader badge over red, yellow, green, which is a kind of a voting scheme when you actually leave out of a talk. So we have interesting data now about how people move through the conference. So I want to be able to use something like pandas and be able to look at the correlation between where people move through the conference, why they go at certain ones, start to ask some questions of this data and see if we can keep tweaking and turning the knobs a little bit to make it a richer, more engaging type of experience. I think that some tools like these that I just mentioned. So those Python will be on my list, Java is going to be on my list, and some of the AI/ML frameworks in 2018 will be on my list.
Excellent.
All right, Charles. So we're coming up to a wrap here. Before we hop off this podcast, though, something you said on day 2 of QCon San Francisco kind of resonated with me. So for those of you that are listening, in the mornings we do this bit about what's going on during the day and some things about InfoQ and QCon. So this year on day 2 at QCon San Francisco, you made some comments about contributing and writing in software. Could you talk a bit about what you said and why you felt like you should share that with everybody?
Yeah, I absolutely can. Thank you. So I feel this is just a really exciting time in software. I think we have extraordinary access to all sorts of things. We have these extraordinary open source libraries that we can go and grab from GitHub or whatever. We have incredible amounts of computer power kind of at our fingertips via, cloud services, AWS, Azure, whatever it is. We have some of the things that we've been talking about, this explosion of AI and ML related libraries. There are amazing things that we can do. I honestly think it's one of the most interesting times in software that I can remember. I also think that there are some very specific risks and challenges that come along with some of that. It's kind of a great power comes with great responsibility thing. And we've seen some of the risks and downsides of some of this stuff exposed this year, I think, to some extent, or possibly last year. What I believe really passionately, when I started in software like 20 plus years ago, and when I started, people didn't really talk to each other. You weren't, open source wasn't really a thing. One company wouldn't talk to another company. Even within companies, sometimes it was hard to get teams of developers to talk about what they were doing, never mind across. I think that's changed to a great extent. I think that's a really good thing. I feel really strongly that our industry is absolutely at its best when it's sharing what it's learning with each other, right? I don't really mind how you do that. Yes, you could speak at QCon, you could speak at InfoQ, and that would be great. But, write a blog, put something out on Twitter, speak at a dev meetup, whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. Just share your knowledge and share your experience, because I think as an industry, that's really how we make progress, how we improve, and also maybe how we avoid some of the mistakes. It's something that I feel very keenly. To the extent, actually, we were talking about New Year's resolutions before. So I have made a New Year's resolution in the last week, which is I'm going to put together a sort of soft skills talk around managing distributed teams, which is essentially what I do now, which slightly terrifies me because all the conference talks I've done before are technical talks, which is just a very different thing. But I kind of feel like, I've been doing this job a little while and I've learned a few things along the way, and maybe it's time I should share things. But yeah, that's what I would urge everyone to do. Just think about what you've learned and think about how you would like to share that with the wider world. Because I think, as I say, for an industry, that's just how we progress.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that's a great place for us to end. Thank you for listening to the InfoQ podcast in 2017. It's been my incredible pleasure to host these podcasts. I think we've been doing this, for just over a year now, Charles, something like that?
A little over a year, yeah.
We've got to somewhere around 10,000 listens per month across both the InfoQ culture and
A lot more than that, actually. Our best week is 17,000 plays in a week.
So 17,000 plays in a week. Wow. So thank you for allowing us onto your commutes. Thank you for allowing us onto your jogs. And we really hope to join you for more in 2018. So thank you for listening to the InfoQ podcast. Charles, thanks for joining us, and let's do this again next year.
Will do. Thank you very much, Wes. It was great fun.